because there are more producers that find out that it's worthwhile going into the business. But typically, the demand reaction in a market is quicker than the supply reaction in the market. So what happens is that if we study perceived shortages, that is the shortages that we perceive in a market, which is influenced by the demand. If the demand increases, then shortages are perceived, and supply. If supply increases, shortages are reduced with a delay, that is. Then this creates somewhat of a complexity. Notice that the first delay from price to supply deals with production capacity. The second delay, which you see over here, deals with are there inventories, and you need to drain those inventories to recognize that supply has an influence on the shortages. So delays then distribute the effects, in this case, of the price, if we set the price up or down, through the system over time. You have a fairly immediate demand reaction, and you have a delayed supply reaction. And what that means is that the delays tend to obscure the relationship between cause and effect. Let's have a look at that. So, for instance, it is difficult to identify the problems. That is, what are their causes? If we look at perceived shortages and we experience that shortages are going up, that might be a result of increased demand. When? Well, just a short while ago, yesterday or the day before. Or it might be a result of reduced supply. When? Well, 3 months ago. So in other words, you see something. Is this a result of what happened yesterday, or is it a result of something that happened much, much, much earlier because there was a delay in the response? And we don't know. We have to investigate that. So in other words, it could be both. It could be a response to demand increasing, a couple of days ago and until now, and then the supply that was cut down 3 months ago, and therefore leading to a drainage of the warehouses now. So where does this come from? And the interesting thing, in this particular case, it comes from the same variable. It could come from the same variable, namely price. But was it the price change that decreased yesterday that led to more demand, or was it the price change that decreased 3 months ago that led to less supply? Which of the two changes leads to the perceived shortages today? So in other words, what you're seeing here is that our issue here, our problem, our performance indicator is the shortages. And the question is, what influenced that? And you can see that there might be multiple answers to that question depending on what time horizon we're working with. Now, what's very interesting in this case is that when price goes, let's say price goes down, then demand will go up, and that will lead to shortages, and supply will go down, and that will lead to shortages. In other words, the same variable moving in the same direction both causes the same effect in the short run as in the long run. In many systems, what you see is opposite reactions. In other words, you have a variable, it changes. In the short run, it creates one effect. In the long run, it creates another effect. And this is what you see when you are negotiating between worse before better or better before worse. So in other words, do I do this now and take the punishment later, or do I do the punishment now and take the benefits later? And that would be typical assessments that you need to do, and models help you to make those assessments and help you understand what's going on, to make a rational decision, even though it might hurt, at least in the shorter run. The other thing is that one thing is, as we've seen, how do you diagnose an issue? How do you diagnose a system? How do you explain what's going on? The other thing is, how do you take action? How do you know which variables to influence, how much to influence, or in what direction to influence, and how much, and when can you expect the results of that. So in other words, to take effective action is also very difficult in systems where you have multiple delays, where this thing happens now and this thing may happen later and this much later than that, you know. So delays really confuses you both in terms of finding out what's going on and in terms of what should you be doing about it. So it doesn't get very much easier if you recognize that there is a feedback in the system, namely that the shortages that are being perceived are not only being perceived by you but also by the market and by competitors, and that may lead to changes in price. So in other words, we have feedback loops, and that's what you have in regular markets. You have a feedback loop, which is the market loop the demand loop that goes very fast, and the supply loop that may go more sluggishly. One of the problems is that it goes slowly when you build capacity, when you build supply. It may be going very fast when you cut supply. So there is a rack effect here. There is a situation where you may have different delays depending on how the system is developing over time. So here I write a note on econometrics. I don't know whether I should say this or not, but econometrics is, of course, you know, looking at a particular time horizon. And one of the problems is that in econometrics, we have a tendency to cut a lot of feedback loops. And the reason is that feedback loops creates creates problems for estimation, let's put it that way. This means that you try to estimate parameters assuming that there is no feedback in the system, or very little feedback in the system. And you can do that. So if you cut the loops over here and you don't look at the supply line, then for short-term periods you can live with that. As long as the supply does not change significantly. If you want to look at the supply dynamics, then perhaps the market dynamics are not so important. So you need, in other words, to define what is your time horizon. And the time horizon in many ways defines which feedback loops are important to be included in your study. And that's, you know, because of this cutting of feedback loops, which are the long feedback loops, of course, that are being cut in econometrics. Those econometric methods leads to predictions that are fine, you know, 2-3 years ahead, but not very much further than that, because then the long feedback loops that are ignored are kicking in society. So an example of that, and you know, the typical example that system dynamicists come up with is the Ceausescu family that was worried about the development of the population in Romania, because the Warsaw Pact countries, where the power of each of the countries were determined by the amount of population in those countries, and in Romania the economic conditions were such that people were using, you know, contraceptives and they were using abortion as a way to reduce the number of births, therefore the population was dwindling. And what the Ceausescu family found out was that they were going to stop abortions, they were going to prevention, they were going to prevent people from importing and using contraceptives and so on, in an attempt at increasing the population. And what happened is phenomenal. You could see a, you know, steep increase after about 9 months or so in the population increase. So in other words, the birth rate went up. And that was there, you know, that was fine for about a year or so, and then the birth rate came down again. Illegal abortion clinics were established, and contraceptives were smuggled, and so on and so forth. And we also saw the development of these orphanages, because people were not officially having children, so they put them out there on the street and created an enormous social problem that we discovered after the breakdown of the Ceausescu regime. So in other words, what you saw there was, yes, the policy was working very well in the beginning, and then it didn't work after a while. So in other words, they didn't have a long-term assessment of what the public would do. When the government is deciding on new tax laws, they will get a very steep increase in their income from those tax laws. And then over a period of time, lawyers find out ways to avoid those taxes. And then after 3 years, you see that, that tax law didn't have the effect other than, redistributing the money, because, then you can evade those taxes. So typically, whatever the public is doing, you need to have a long-term perspective on that. The time horizon, in other words, determines the system you want to study. Okay, so we're going to look at feedback since we introduced that. And the complexity of systems is not so that you have, on the one hand, accumulation processes, and then you add on the feedback. No, they work together, they synergize. So circular causality leads to us to reason in circles, right? A influences B, which influences C, which influences A, which, so you become pretty crazy unless you remember that there is actually a delay in there. So you need the delay, you need the accumulation, because otherwise cause become effect and effect becomes cause instantaneously. So in other words, what we have to say is that B influences A, which eventually over time will generate a reaction in B. In other words, there is a delay in the process here. You progress in time. And that's important to recognize, that you need to have delays, short or long. Now let's take this example here and let's say the following. We're now in a speculative market, and the world has experienced speculation, major speculation in housing and in other commodities, gold and so on and so forth, currencies, in order to place the money where you think that the value of the money will increase the strongest. So in other words, suppose you have a commodity and you see that the price goes up. Normally the reaction would be that the market will demand less of that commodity. But if this is a durable commodity, which can be seen as an investment, for instance, houses, then maybe you speculate and you invest in those houses. So when price goes up, speculative demand goes up. And in terms of shortages, you don't distinguish speculative demand from regular demand. So, if this is a strong reaction, then speculative demand goes up, shortages goes up, and price goes up. What kind of feedback loop is that? Well, you recognize it as a reinforcing or positive feedback. On the other hand, when prices goes up, speculative supply would go down in the commodity market, because people will retain what they have and say, I don't want to sell this house because it now increases in value. So they will keep it to themselves. I don't want to sell my gold, it's increasing in value. So whatever is increasing in value is kept, and therefore speculative supply goes down, which leads to an increase in perceived shortages, right? Positive feedback loop. So what this means is that when prices goes up, shortages goes up, prices goes up even more. So what you see is a development over time which leads to an exponential growth. Now this may take a long time. Stock market grows over 4, 5, 6, 7 years, and it's often considered to be a sound growth because companies should grow in value. The problem is that this creates often bubbles, because the value of the stocks in a market tend to go far beyond the fundamental value of the company, because it is speculation that drives the value. What happens now if some of the major players here are suddenly saying, I just don't want to sit with all these stocks. I want to dump them on the market. So suddenly supply goes up, shortages goes down, prices are dropping, and what happens now is that the two feedback loops that we've studied that worked, let's say, well on the way up, are now working also, but this time on the way down. So the lower the price, the less demand, the less demand, the less shortages. The lower the price, the more supply of the stocks on the market, and the lower the shortages. In other words, prices are dropped even stronger. And this happens not over 5 to 6, 8 years. This happens in a couple of days. So there is a panic here on the stock market or commodity market, which brings the prices down very strongly. Now, as I said, there might be a development of the fundamental value of the commodity that should be going like the gray line or blue line here, but not in the form of a bubble that we see. So speculation may take over, and these feedback loops that we study here, the positive feedback loops, are governing the system for a period of time. On the way up, there is a tendency for the market to reinforce those loops, right? You tend to, you've seen brokers in very many markets. They are pushing you to buy. They're pushing you to buy so that the price goes up, so that you buy even more, right? And they're advertising and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of market forces that brings up the price into a bubble, and then you want to reinforce those loops. You know, things are going well in society. And then suddenly when things goes wrong, and this is important, the very same mechanism reverses, right? The positive feedback loops are working, but they're working in the bad way. Then what you want to do is to say, take power away from that, introduce regulators, stop that speculation, and so on and so forth. And you try to bring the system into balance by reinforcing the regular market mechanisms, the ones that were governing the market before speculation started. So in other words, we're trying to manage the system by reinforcing loops and by weakening loops, reinforcing the favorable loops, or what is perceived to be favorable, and then weakening those loops that limit us, or weakening those loops that drive us into despair. So, you know, keep that in mind. I have another example of feedback loops that are interacting here. And in this case, we have a high-tech company. It receives revenues from the market, and it has a choice to invest in R&D, research and development, or it can invest in production capacity. In the beginning, typically a high-tech company would invest in R&D. And the quality of the product that they're developing, the prototypes, will increase as investments are being made. Then, of course, there is a negative feedback loop that says, you know, in the beginning you gain a lot of quality for your money invested, but then gradually it becomes more and more difficult to create the perfect product. So for instance, in the pharmaceutical industry, you create a medication, and then much of the time you try to tune it properly, you try to avoid side effects of the medication, and so on and so forth. Finally, you got the medication that is ready for the market. So now you decide on a price, and the price-quality ratio, that is how much you have to pay for it relative to what you gain in terms of quality, is important in determining demand for the product. So more quality leads to more demand, given a certain price. Okay, now you have demand for the product, but you don't have a market because you don't have any production capacity. You just have the idea. You've made the invention here. And what is now happening is that you tend to put more emphasis on the investment in production. So you get production capacity, and then you have a production rate which is determined partly by your capacity and partly by your demand. That fills up your inventory level, and now, only now, you can sell. And then of course the sales are reducing your inventory level. And now I'm just going to say that the sales together with the price gives you revenues. So now we're closing two loops. One is the R&D loop that started out the process, and the other one is the production loop, production capacity and production loop. Notice that in sales you have a nonlinearity. In other words, the two loops meet in sales and create revenues. So if you don't have R&D loop, if you don't have the R&D loop, you don't have a product, so you don't have demand. And therefore, you may have production capacity, doesn't help you. You don't get a sale. On the other hand, if you do have demand but have never invested in production capacity, meaning you don't have an inventory level, you have nothing to sell, then the R&D loop doesn't work. In other words, what you see is that the two loops come together and are mutually dependent on each other. The strength of the sales loop, the strength of the production loop, how fast that is working, how well that generates revenues for you, is dependent on your demand, if you want to call it the parameter demand. But where does that come from? It comes from research and development. And on the other hand, the strength in the research and development loop, the upper loop that you see there, where does that come from? It comes from the inventory level, right? That's a parameter that determines the strength of the R&D loop. Because if you don't have the inventory, you can't sell and therefore generate revenues that creates the foundation for research and development. So in other words, what you see is that one loop constitutes the condition under which the other loop is working. And both of the loops needs to work together in order to create what we intend to do. So in other words, the systemic approach says you got to study the two loops together. And where do they interact? They interact in a non-linear fashion, in a non-linearity. The strength of one loop is determined by the other loops, and vice versa. And of course, then you can say that the relationship between the demand for the product and the supply in the form of an inventory level determines the price. So you can have an endogenous decision about the price. And of course, this tells you how difficult it is to set the price. If you have a very low price, then you have a lot of demand and sales at a low price. If you have a high price, you do get revenues from a high price, but demand is relatively small, so sales are small. So do you target a sophisticated market, or do you target a mass market, depending on the price here? So that's, that trade-off is very difficult. So in other words, management, as I see it from a system dynamics perspective, is to say which are the favorable loops in the system. Let's strengthen those loops. And what you see here is that, the loop that was the production loop, we don't establish that loop until we have a demand, so that we know that that loop has a certain strength. If we didn't have a product, we would never establish a production loop, right? So in other words, we strengthen those loops that we now know will be favorable to us. And we try to weaken the loops that are unfavorable to us, or that don't work very well for us. In other words, we don't invest in R&D if we have a perfect product. There is no reason to do that. So we weaken that loop and we put all our efforts into the other loop. So the challenge is find out what loops are favorable and unfavorable to us. And as we saw in the example of speculation, some loops may be very favorable for us for a period of time, but we better recognize when they start hurting us, or potentially can hurt us, when a bubble is being created. So what is good for us and what's bad for us, that varies over time. It's not constant in nonlinear systems. And that means that we have to survey the system all the time and find out where are the good structures, where are the structures that are helping us right now, where are the bottlenecks that we need to open up, and so on. Now, not only do effects take time, not only do the effects feedback, but the effects also synergize in nonlinear relationships. So what you see here is, you see a feedback that comes back here, and you see that that is not the only thing that influences a variable. There are other things as well, and they interact. They don't add up usually. They multiply, or they form more complex functions in creating a variable. And that means that the effect that you see here coming back is affected by other systems. This system, other things in the world are affecting the feedback that we get here. And that means that if you have a systemic approach, you better study where these other signals are coming from, and maybe even try to take control over that. So, in other words, what we need to study are the nonlinearities as well. I see that I have half an hour to study nonlinearities. Well, that's a course in itself. So let's see how far we get here. Now, there are two kinds of, that was wrong. There are two ways we often portray nonlinearities in systems. And the first one is, for those who are doing system dynamics modeling, is to say, well, you know, the definition is that a response and a change in a variable is conditioned by the state of the system. That is, if the state of the system is like this, then it reacts one way. If the state of the system is like that, it reacts a different way. One of the classical examples is in Augsburg, the two big supermarkets many years ago, when they started to establish supermarkets in Germany. Two competing supermarkets were doing the following. One was saying, well, you know, I have a marketing strategy. If I reduce the price of a very common commodity, I will have people come into my store and they will buy other stuff there as well. So they did. They put down they reduced the price of wash detergent to half. And people came along and they bought wash detergent. But of course they bought a lot of other things as well. So this was a phenomenal strategy. It really sucked the market into their store. So the other company said, that was very smart. And of course we will do the same. So they reduced the price of wash detergent to half the week thereafter. What happened? Nothing. The system didn't react because everybody had wash detergent. They bought in the last week in the other store, right? So this was no incentive to the system. So here what you see now is that the same action led to two different reactions. Why? Because the state of the system, that is how much wash detergent you have at home, determined the reaction of the system. It's a nonlinear reaction. And this is what we experience often in these nonlinear systems. You do one thing, and then based on your experience, you do the same thing. Unfortunately, and you expect things to be to develop as last time. And this time, the system doesn't react that way. So in other words, in nonlinear systems, typically, you can't rely just on your experience. You need a fundamental understanding of the system. You need a structural understanding to recognize that when people have bought wash detergent, they do not react to a reduction in price on wash detergent. You need that systemic insight. Okay, so system dynamicists, when I talk about nonlinearities, they typically think of, oh, there's a nonlinear curve here, and we can put that into a simulation model very easily. So in this case, it's the efficiency in exploration that we're talking about. For instance, in oil exploration. And the point is that this is the fraction of the total resource that remains undiscovered. So we're looking for a resource, oil. And then if nothing has been found, we're out here. If almost everything has been found, identified, we're down here. And this is then the efficiency in that exploration. So in other words, the efficiency is very high when you start looking for oil, because there is oil everywhere, so you can find it. When there is hardly any oil at all, your efficiency is very low. And that's a nonlinear reaction, typically, nonlinear relationship. Now, what can you say about this? If we reduce the value down here on this x-axis, then the reaction in the form of the y-axis, that is how much you react to a certain drop in the value here, is dependent on where you stand. It is dependent on what is the current fraction of the total resource that remains undiscovered. Are you here? Are you here? Are you here? Or are you here? And a, let's say, 10-unit drop here will give much smaller reaction than a 10-unit drop over here, which gives you a very large reaction. So in other words, that the reaction to a change in the fraction of the total resource remaining undiscovered depends on what is the current fraction of the total resource remaining undiscovered. In other words, this variable comes in with two two ways. It says, where are we? And it says, where are we going, or how far are we going? And the two merge in creating an effect. So, in other words, the reaction to a change here is conditioned upon where you are. In other words, what is the state of the system? Characterized by exactly the same variable. So in other words, a nonlinear graph like this, in a way, carries two messages. It carries a message that says you will have a reaction to a change, okay? And it carries the message that, and that change, or that reaction, depends on where the variable is right now, what value it takes. So in other words, there are two pieces of information that come together from the same variable. And this now makes it possible to split the two portions of information originating from the two variables. And that brings us over to a more general characterization of nonlinearity. It is caused by it causes a response to a change in a variable to be conditioned by the state of the system by values not only of the same variable that changes, but of other variables. So the typical example is that you have two subsystems. One produces the variable x, the other one the value of the variable y. These two are multiplied by each other to create z. Multiplication, division, or more complex forms of algebra represents nonlinearities. If you add or subtract, it doesn't. So in other words, if the two are now added, you can do whatever you want in system 1. It can produce whatever value for x it wants, and the change in that value will affect z the same way. If they multiply by each other, the effect created by a change in x is conditioned upon the value of y. If the value of y is 0, doesn't matter what value x is taking. If the value of y is very small, z reacts to a certain change in x very little. If the value of y is very large, z reacts to a change in x very much. In other words, what happens, the reaction in z to what happens over here is conditioned by what happens in another system. Now let's go back to what I've talked about, namely the need for coordination in systems, a systemic approach. In other words, what you see here is that you can work and work and work very hard over here and produce values, but if those are counteracted or conditioned, the effect of that are conditioned by what happens over here, doesn't help. If the sales, oh, you're still here. I thought you were fired. If the sales manager sells and sells and sells, it doesn't have any effect if the system is not able to produce, right? So in other words, it is conditioned upon, do you have enough warehouses here or stuff in the warehouse to deliver? If not, you can work as, your butts off, but it doesn't work at all. Excuse me. It doesn't work at all. It doesn't work at all just because it doesn't have any effect, because the rest of the system is not following up. So, here is the example, or here is the thing that I want you to bring home, and that is that once we have a nonlinearity in a system, the various components of the system interact in creating an effect. And that means that a partial consideration of the system within a particular policy area and doing very well there doesn't help unless you also fix the rest of the system. A systemic approach. So there you see why it is important, particularly important in nonlinear systems, to have a systemic view. Okay, so now I'm going to take you through an example, and I see we have about 20 minutes before the break. Is it okay? Can we go on? And, I think this is so interesting, so I hope you do. Is it okay? Yeah. We can do it. Okay. So here is, I'm going to take it from the Norwegian reality of, finding oil, but, this might be finding resources in general, and you will see that the example can be used in a very general context. In fact, I will, this is where I'm turning, your heads will be spinning, because I'm going to use this model that I developed now and use it for part of the model itself. So there will be a model inside this model that I developed that will be similar to the model that I'm developing. Did you get that? Well, maybe. We'll see. Okay, so here is the system. The system is that the yield from exploration of oil to finding oil depends on investments in exploration and the productivity of those investments. Okay? So now the investments are coming from the financial system. The productivity is coming from two different systems. One is the technological system. You develop technology to find more oil, and you're getting more and more advanced in doing so. The other one is the exploration system. That is the oil reserve itself. And what you can say is that if you have a small, not very sophisticated technology, as long as nothing has been found yet, it doesn't take much to find oil. As you're draining the reserves of oil, you need to go out in more and more hostile environments, North Sea, Barents Sea, North Pole, and so on and so forth, in order to find it. So you need more and more sophisticated technology. So that's the idea here, that the productivity from technology comes in and is modified by the effect of exploration. If you have drained the reserve, then you can invest in technology, invest in technology, invest in technology. You will find no more because there is nothing more to be found. Right? So that's how the two are interacting. So let's have a look at the stock and flow, in a sense, concept of the reserve. Here we have the undiscovered resource, and here you have the cumulative addition to identified resource. Wow, that's terrible. That's the oil that's been found. So we've found this oil, and we have not found this oil, and the total amount is this one. The undiscovered resource can be subdivided into two. It is the technologically or technically discoverable resource that's remaining in the ground, and the technically undiscoverable resource that's remaining. Now, of course, what is the division between the two is the level of technology. If you increase the level of technology here, you will include more of the oil in the technically discoverable resource, and you will deplete the technically undiscoverable resource. So lifting this roof here will allow you to find more oil. On the other hand, how far do you explore? Well, you explore up to that level now. So this is what we have found. This is what we can find with current technology. This is what we cannot find with current technology. And of course, what you do is to first push up the technology level to open up for an opportunity to explore. Push up technology level to explore. Push up technology level to explore. So that's the way it goes. Okay, so the productivity from the technology is usually defined as the technically discoverable resource remaining, the technically discoverable resource remaining over the undiscovered resource. So it's the portion that is green in the undiscovered resource. That's from technology, and it's defined by this line here. Now, the effect of the exploration on productivity, that is, the effect of how far you've already used the technology, exploited the technology to find oil, is defined by the undiscovered resource, which is the entire box here, compared to the total resource. So those are the two productivity determining factors here. And that is, of course, defined by this line here. So in other words, if you look at now this relationship that we talked about, the yield, it is determined by the investment multiplied by those two productivity determining factors. And you see that undiscovered resource is you divide by undiscovered resource in one of them, and you multiply in the other one, so we can eliminate undiscovered resource. And what you have is the technically discoverable resource remaining compared to the entire resource that we were working with. In other words, what fraction is discoverable right now? So in other words, if you want a high productivity, you better open up by increasing your technological level, and you better be careful about your exploration, your finding of oil. But of course you won't be that. So you're pushing and pushing and pushing. And as you find more oil, you need to develop more technology to enable you to find more oil next time around, in order to keep this volume, the green volume here, as large as possible to enable you to have a high level of productivity. So it's an interplay between the two. Why did now I see. So the question is, can this model be used in a totally different context? Now I see that I've shortened the slideshow, so that's good. Well, yes, it can. Suppose that you have patients in a hospital, and all the patients are here. These are the patients that are currently being treated. These are the patients that technologically considered can be treated. Question is, can you afford it? It costs a lot of money to do so. And these are the patients that you technologically considered cannot save, cannot treat. Technological process opens up for an opportunity to treat more patients. Whether you do so or not depends on the social, a very important social factor. Can we let the technology be there without utilizing it for the purpose of treating people? And we do know that for elderly, and as the society is growing older and older to some extent, then the elderlies are, this trade-off becomes very difficult. You know, we know that older people are not going to live forever, and to what extent do we use our medical resources to invest in keeping them alive? It's a terrible, thought, but it's a thought that the medical community is facing every day, and it's the responsibility, they say, it's the responsibility of the politicians to determine whether we can afford to use a particular medication or not. So, you see that the model can be now turned into a model that is very, very different and applied to a different field. So, let me just see maybe I'll have the time to go into the details of this slideshow anyway, but we'll see. So, excuse me, can I ask you, did I skip some slides now? I was just a little bit confused here. I didn't do that. Okay, good. So then I'll just move on. So what we can see is that nonlinearities causes effects to be blended, right? The effect of what comes from this subsystem and this subsystem and this subsystem, they interact in creating an effect. So that means that nonlinearities makes it difficult to establish experience. We talked about that in the Augsburg case. To rely on the fact that last time the system reacted this way, so this time it will react that way, that is not necessarily a valid conclusion. So very often, therefore, we need to go in and study how are the mechanisms, how are the structure of the system creating their behavior. We need to find out what are the underlying causes, to what's happening, and what leverage points, what dosage, and what timing, in our treatment should we be choosing. And we can only do so if we have a structural understanding of what we're doing here. So nonlinearity makes it very difficult also to utilize formal analysis. You talked about, can we optimize policies? Well, it's very difficult to do a formal optimization in nonlinear systems. Mathematics is not served as well there, other than through numerical analyses, where we search for optimal solutions, which we also use in system dynamics. So in other words, system dynamics, SD, is we're trying to push ourselves into developing more realistic models, models that in a better way and a transparent way portray reality. We try to go away from abstraction, very simple models, 6 equation that defines the entire national economy. That just doesn't cut it for me. So we need to be more realistic, so we're pushing ourselves in that direction. Now what happens is that these very abstract, very simple models, they're wonderful for optimization. When we crawl up the line here, it becomes more and more difficult for us to find super optimal conditions. But as a Swedish guy told me, comforting me, he says it's better to find, it's better to be almost right than precisely wrong with 6 decimal points. In other words, you know, if you can find, if you can search for, identify a satisfactory solution, that's much better than to optimize and be sure that you have found the optimal, just the wrong optimal, because you have the wrong model. You don't have a proper representation of reality, and taking that solution, the exact solution, into consideration will bring the system the wrong way. The last thing that I'm, oh, now I come to what I thought. Okay, so I'll do this very short. Because it brings us into the next lecture, which deals with shift in feedback loop dominance or structural significance. So this is where nonlinearity then comes in. Nonlinearity causes endogenous or internal shifts in structural dominance. Nonlinearities are necessary, you might say, to see these shifts that I'm so concerned about. So in linear systems, we don't find that. And you know, most of the textbooks are in linear dynamics, not nonlinear dynamics. So you know, it's very often not addressed. So I'll keep this very simple, and you will see that some of the slides later on addresses this petroleum identification example, which can be analyzed exactly the same way as I do with this very simple diffusion model. So let's look at that. We are 6 minutes or so from the break. So we're soon there. This is the simple diffusion model. It is represented in the form of a stock and flow diagram and in the form of a causal loop diagram. So in this case, whether you want to talk about this as a market model or as a diffusion model of disease or as a model of spreading a message or employing a technology in society, diffusion can be used in many contexts. You have a number of susceptible people there. They listen to you or they're infected by you. They convert through a recruitment into become infectious people, and they infect others. They tell about the phenomenal coffee machine that has been produced now, and everybody should be going and buying it. So they affect others to become adopters of the technology. Or they infect others and make them infectious as well. So super simple model that you probably all have been working with. Okay, it creates the kind of S-shaped growth or decay that you see here in infectious and susceptibles. And the question is, how may this S-shaped behavior be explained? Now, for a second, let us assume that the number of susceptibles are constant. You could think of that as a market where new people are coming into the market at the rate of people being converted, recruited. That's unrealistic, but let's just keep that thought for a second. What that means is that the positive feedback loop here has a constant input or constant parameter governing that loop. And that's the number of susceptibles. And let's see how things would develop with a certain number of susceptibles, constant. Well, that will create an increase, exponential increase in the number of infections, wherever they should be coming from, right? So now, if I reduce the number of susceptibles and let that be a constant, the consequent development in the number of infectious will be less. So what you clearly see here is that the strength of the positive loop here that says the more that are infected, the more will be infected, and the more that will be infected, the more you have next time around. Next time around, that's the delay. Okay, so what that means is that the strength of the loop is governed by that parameter so far. And then, if you look at the actual development of susceptibles, it will go like this. I'll explain that later. And that will cause the number of infectious to first increase very quickly, and then the increase will be slower and slower and slower. So that's the development that you see caused by a change in the parameter of susceptible. Now we turn around, we flip over and say, let's assume that the number of infectious are constant. And we look at how that governs the negative feedback loop, which says that the more you recruit, the less are left next time in susceptibles to be recruited. So if the infectious is very small here, we will see that the number of susceptibles are going down like this, very slowly. If we increase the number of infectious, you will have a stronger decay in the number of susceptibles. Well, what actually happens is that the infectious are increasing, causing what? Causing the susceptibles to come down this way. First it comes down like this, then it comes down like this, then it comes down like this. It's actually a negative feedback loop that governs the system, but you don't see it. It looks like a positive feedback loop because of the increase in the number of infectious that you have here. So in other words, the number of infectious creates the shape of the number of susceptibles, and the number of susceptibles creates the shape of the infectious. So what we see here, of course, then if you continue like this, it will develop like this next time around. You have the same mutual influence. So what we see here is the following, that the structure of the system determines how the number of infectious develop over time and the number of susceptibles develop over time. And the number of infectious determines the strength, that is the dominance of the negative feedback loop. The number of susceptibles determines the strength or the dominance of the positive feedback loop. When you start the system, there are lots of susceptibles, therefore the positive loop is working so strongly. When you then have drained the system, there are few susceptibles but many infectious, therefore the negative feedback loop is taking control. So you have a shift in feedback loop dominance. And that means that the structure creates a behavior in the susceptibles and infectious. Those two variables are actually parameters that determines the strength of the two loops, changing the relative dominance of those over time, which feeds back to create a new kind of behavior. First, we have a positively dominant behavior, and then a negatively dominant behavior. So in other words, structure creates a behavior that feeds back to determine the relative importance of the two loops that then determine the further development, in other words, the behavior of the system. Structure creates behavior, behavior feeds back to determine the relative significance, to determine the structure of the system. Exactly what I talked about yesterday and now this morning. So then, as you can see, I'm just talking about this right now very, very, very briefly. If we go back to the exploration of oil and the exploitation of that oil in the form of production, then you will see that exactly the same kind of reasoning can be used there. And the same kind of reasoning can be used in the context of the technology we're using for exploring petroleum. I don't have time right now before the break, but at some point of time later this afternoon, when we do the hands-on stuff, if we still have time, I can continue with this and link it up to what I've already said. But, you know, that's summarizing what I wanted to say. It is, there are delays, there is feedback, and there are nonlinearities. And these three elements of complexity interact in creating the complex dynamic development that you see in the systems that we study. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. So it was a brilliant first session. Now we have a coffee break. See you back here in half an hour so that we will start with the second session before the lunch. Thanks.